Hello, everybody, and welcome to the pilot episode, the debut of the PHLY Draft Show with Fran Duffy. We're going to talk about all things draft from now through the draft and beyond with Fran Duffy, the All-City draft expert. How you doing?
Doing great. I'm excited to get going here. Obviously, look, I know it's like the start of draft season. We've got all-star games coming up. The national championship game was this week, but a lot to break down. I've been doing a lot of work on all these prospects. This is the first time now that I could share all of my thoughts unedited on all these players. It's going to be a lot of fun here the next few months.
I have known your draft sickness for over a decade.
Yeah.
It's a little bit terrifying to me that we're going to unleash this onto the world. But I think it's very exciting for the draft sickos out there.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. A lot of notes on players, a lot of thoughts. We'll have, I had my first mock draft last week. That was my first time I've published a mock draft in a long time. So I'm very excited for what's to come.
And I think it's great that we can announce that in addition to this show, which will have you covered, you've got the mock draft, which is out. If you are a diehard with PHLY or any of the All-City markets, you will also have access to your database, your notes on every player in the draft. You have been watching these players since the fall. I mean, this is the thing that to me encapsulates your sickness, and now you really are sharing it with the world. It's very exciting.
Yeah, and the way I'm kind of looking at it is because it's a process that is constantly changing. I'm always adding info, and so as I'm adding info on players, look, because I haven't seen I haven't seen any of these players really up close in person. So that'll change here this coming weekend, and so as I start to get eyes on these players, both at the All-Star games and then at the Combine, that's going to change some things. So rankings will slide here and there. So you're instead of getting one final rankings update in late April, you'll get a chance to be able to say, all right, like this is how guys rise, fall,
living, breathing
throughout the process. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
All right, well, it's very exciting. I want to ask you at the end of the show today about what you're looking forward to at the Shrine game and the Senior Bowl as you get off and get ready to go this week. But let's get into it right now. Let's bring the pickies to the trough. The mock draft that you have published on All-City. We're going to work our way through the top 10 and a few other interesting picks throughout the first round. Let's get right into it. Number 1 overall. The Tennessee Titans select
quarterback Cam Ward from the University of Miami. Now, look, I went into this process of doing this mock draft not really sure where I was going to have the quarterbacks because I'm not completely sold on either of them as like, oh yeah, definitely want to take this guy this high. That said, I think when you look at the teams at the top of the draft as we sit here in early January, I think these teams are kind of backed into a corner where you almost have to take a quarterback. And these guys are talented. There are pathways to them having NFL success. I don't think that this class is as bad as the one that we saw a couple years ago with Kenny Pickett, where he goes in the middle of round 1 and we don't see another until later. I do think that these guys are going to go in the first round. That said, I think when you look at Cam Ward, his upside, his traits, I think that's alluring for a team holding the number 1 pick.
All right, so the 2 quarterbacks who everybody expects to be at the top of the draft, Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. Give me sort of a compare contrast their styles, what kinds of quarterbacks they are.
I think when you look at Cam Ward, dynamic, quick twitch type of athlete that can make people miss. His arm is really impressive. He can make every throw. I think if you want to kind of put him into a box, he's built in a way he's a little bit bigger, a little bit taller, but he's similar to Kyler Murray in terms of that twitch in the pocket to be able to make people miss and create. But he's got some magic to him to be able to make some of those plays down the field as a runner. There's a calmness to the way he plays. I remember week 1 against Florida. They go on the road in the swamp. It's his first game playing for Miami, and he was outstanding in that football game and just made everything look easy. And I think when you look at the way that Jaden Daniels played this year in Washington, some of the late game heroics, some of the things that he did late in games to vault that team to victory. He did a lot of that, Cam Ward, for Miami this year. A lot of fourth quarter comebacks, a lot of games where they're down early and then they come back. I think when you look at the way that he can impact the game as a runner and as a receiver with those traits, there's a lot to get excited about. And he's a 5-year starter. Started his career at Incarnate Word, the FCS level. Worked his way up to Washington State. Followed one of his coaches from FCS up to Washington State. Started there the last 2 years. Was going to come out in the draft last year. Was accepted to go to the Shrine Bowl, would have been a day 3 pick, but said, you know what, I'm going to go back into the transfer portal, goes back for another year, and he played, was outstanding this year for Miami. He was a Heisman finalist, was one of the best quarterbacks in college football, and now here he is in round 1.
So you brought up Jaden Daniels, and stylistically, I'm not sure it's a perfect match, but storytelling-wise, it does sound familiar to me in terms of this guy has been in college for a long time, transfers and has a huge year somewhere else. In the league now, I think they're a little bit more patient with like older quarterbacks, right?
Yep.
It's not such a big deal. I feel like the Jaden Daniels rookie season maybe helps Cam Ward a little bit.
Yeah, and over the last few years, there have been some cases. Joe Burrow would be another
Sure.
example of that kind of player from LSU, right? So I think that, and honestly, I feel very strongly about this now, if maybe even differently than I did a year ago at this point, where to me, every quarterback should basically exhaust every ounce of eligibility. Maybe not every single one. There are going to be those cases where, all right, it makes sense for this guy, a third-year junior, to come out. But I think when you look at all of these players, the leash is so short in the NFL now.
That's
the patience is wearing thin. To me, people talk about like, oh, you want to get to that second contract faster. I think you want to set yourself up to have basically immediate success. We've seen these guys come in, and if you're swimming early, the coach is getting fired, the offense coordinator is getting fired, or the quarterback getting benched. We saw a couple of high picks get benched here midseason. One was able to bounce back in Bryce Young, the other not so much in Anthony Richardson. And Richardson, we all knew, was going to be extremely raw. He only had a handful of starts coming in, but still it feels like the patience is worn thin. So to me, if you're all these guys, and I'm glad, Drew Aller went back to Penn State. Garrett Nussmeier went back to LSU. There are a couple other quarterbacks that seemed like they were going to enter the draft. Carson Beck declared and then said, you know what? I'm going to go back to school. Yeah. So I think when you look at it overall, it feels like everybody understands that that's kind of the atmosphere right now.
So in terms of the caliber of prospect that Cam Ward is, I think you think that he's not necessarily like a 1-1 type guy, but the situation here makes that the case. If he was in last year's draft class as a prospect this year, where would he have fallen in the pecking order of those guys?
For me, he would have been behind Bo Nix.
Really?
And I was a pretty pro Bo Nix fan last year, so I had faith that he would be a starter. Not a high level one, but
Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Drake May.
Yep.
You had Nix.
I had Nix next ahead of Penix.
Okay.
So I feel like he would have been in that Nix Penix range.
And what about JJ
me.
McCarthy?
Actually, I had McCarthy ahead of. I think I had him right ahead of Bo Nix. So that's a good question. So
Cam Ward in that class
would have been
as a prospect
QB5,
this year
QB6.
would have been 5 or 6.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. And now compared to Shedeur Sanders, why Ward over Sanders?
All right, so with Sanders, I think that he plays a little bit better within structure than Ward does. I think that he can go out and execute one of those pro-style offenses you feel good about. He's gotten pro coaching over the course of his career. His offensive coordinator the last year and change, Pat Shurmur, a coach that a lot of people in the NFL are very familiar with. He's had various stops around the league.
Super exciting guy.
Right. Well, look, I think that is important that he can come into the NFL having that understanding of how things work, schematically from that end of it. But I think when you look at Shedeur, he's another guy. I mean, the touch and accuracy really stand out. The ball placement is impressive. His toughness on the field, he has been under duress basically from Jump Street. At Colorado the last 2 years, he's been sacked more than any quarterback in football. He's been pressured more than any quarterback in football. That said, he has developed some bad habits because of that, and that does worry me a little bit. And I think as you saw his senior season progress, especially once you got to about midseason, his pocket presence, his ability to manage muddy situations in there. You saw him kind of eject from the pocket vertically, basically work backwards in the pocket. That's got me a little bit spooked in terms of what he can do going into a not so clean situation in the NFL. Tennessee, the Titans, that offensive line, I know they've got Bill Callahan. They're going to get that straightened out. But right now, I mean, those quarterbacks were under duress. The right side of the offensive line was a mess this year. So plugging Shedeur Sanders into a situation like that where you're not sure about what the offensive line is going to look like, if he's got to play early, I think it could get ugly. And so that's one of the things that, to me, I look at and I say, all right, Cam Ward probably set up for better success right away than Shedeur Sanders.
All right. We move now to the number 2 overall selection, the Cleveland Browns taking the reigning Heisman Trophy winner, Travis Hunter. And I love this conversation.
Yeah.
I know that maybe some people are tired of it, but to me, it's fascinating. As an NFL team, what do you do with Travis Hunter, who can obviously be a pro-caliber first-round prospect at 2 different positions? What would you do?
Well, he's been adamant that he wants to play both positions. So he wants to play both wide receiver and corner. I think the only way for him to do that is to play corner full-time, go to the defensive side. You're in defensive meetings during the week because it's the positionless football argument. Like, oh, he can do all these different things. Well, he's got to do something first. Like, there's got to be 1A at the top of that list. And you can't be a full-time wide receiver, go into the offensive meetings, and then say, oh, you know what, I'm going to have a package on defense. No, he's got to be full-time defense, and then he's going to get a package of plays offensively, or he's just a full-time receiver and doesn't play corner at all. So I think that the path, if he does want to play both ways, is that he's going to be a corner first and then a wide receiver. he might decide that he just wants to be a receiver. There might be teams out there that say, I just want him to be a receiver. But I think when you look at Cleveland, I think that this makes a lot of sense for them to add a blue chip talent. To me, like Travis Hunter, if we're talking to all the top talents in this draft, he's the cleanest of the guys at the top, the guy that I feel most confident in saying this would be a top 5, top 10 caliber player in any draft.
It's an interesting tension because you can argue about which one is more valuable.
Yep.
Certainly wide receivers get paid more, and there's probably a longer run time of being an elite player than there is a corner. So he is incentivized to be a wide receiver, but you don't want to waste what he brings to the table on defense. Would you say that as a prospect, he's a slightly better prospect as a corner than as a wide receiver?
I do think he's a slightly better prospect as a corner. And I've actually done with him.
So if he was just a wide receiver,
yes,
would he be worthy of the number 2 pick?
No.
Okay, interesting.
I don't think he'd be worthy of the number 2. I still think he'd be a first-round caliber receiver, but I don't think he'd be worthy of the number 2 pick. I think if you looked at him as a corner, I think you're in a. We're going to say this. I'm going to say this a lot. In this draft, he would be a number 2 pick. We'll get into the whys behind that, but in this draft, I would feel comfortable taking him if he's gonna play defense. Now, if you're gonna say he's gonna play offense, like going back to the conversation about the quarterbacks, where would I put Travis Hunter if he was a receiver going up to last year? He's probably wide receiver 3 or 4, maybe. Like I would have had Harrison and Neighbors ahead of him as a prospect.
Or so he'd be around Odunze.
Probably.
Okay. And so the cornerback is doing the heavy lifting here. And again, the in this draft. What makes him as a corner a special prospect?
Yeah, I mean, he's got great size. The movement really, really stands out. He's really smooth. He has recovery speed. He can turn and run with anybody. He's really competitive. And then also what he does from a route instinct standpoint. That's the thing, is that this guy's playing every snap essentially on defense, on offense. He's still playing some special teams. He's got a 4.0 GPA off the field. When he does play defense, they put him in single coverage on an island nonstop. We've never seen anything like this. It's so much fun. And for him to be like the kind of kid he is off the field as well, you just feel so good about what he's going to be moving forward.
I'm just trying to think through if he could do both. I mean, the problem is you can't just say, okay, you just go out be on an island. You can't just have a defense there.
No,
he's got to know.
He has to know the defense.
Yeah.
So if he's going to play defense at all, he's got to be a corner first.
And then maybe it's 15 plays a game on offense or something, like a red zone package, a third down package. Okay. It's going to be interesting.
Yes.
All right, number 3 overall, the New York Giants. They do take Shedeur Sanders, the quarterback from Colorado. Would be especially juicy if Dion gets named the Cowboys head coach in the division together. I feel like that would not be the case. Maybe the Giants wouldn't take him. However, you gave us the scouting report on Shedeur already, but in terms of a fit here, like you like the structure with Brian Daboll. Is this a thing that could work?
Yeah, I think that I still have a lot of respect for what Daboll is as like an offensive designer and a game planner, a play caller. I think to me, look, the Giants, they're backed into a corner. They're very clearly on their last legs with ownership, right? With Joe Shane and with Brian Daboll. This is going to be their last run at it. If they don't have success here this year, it's not going to look good for them for 2026. And so they have to have an answer at quarterback. You moved on from Daniel Jones. You made that move already. And so now it's all right, well, what are your options? So you're either going to go with a round 1 rookie or you're going to go to the pro market. I don't know that they're going to be able to get Sam Darnold to go back to New York. Who else are you getting inside? Are you gonna? Is Kirk Cousins enough to save your job if you're that organization?
Kenny Pickett.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. Like, is that enough? There's been conversation. Oh well, if Minnesota keeps Sam Darnold, maybe it's JJ McCarthy. The Giants 8 months ago could have taken JJ McCarthy. They decided not to, and all that's changed since then is he has a season-ending injury.
Yeah.
He had a nice preseason and then got hurt, and so I don't see them saying, all right, we're going to make that move to go get JJ McCarthy. So for me, I think they have to take one of these quarterbacks. Now, I do think that, and there's been like some scuttlebutt out there that they like Ward more than Sanders, but they're picking a number 3. And this is like the whole thing that happened to them last year is that they wanted to make a move for a quarterback, but no one wanted to make that move. So if they don't have a dance partner, if Tennessee doesn't want to move down, if they want to sit there and take Ward, they kind of have to take Sanders if they're going to have a shot moving forward.
Okay, we move on to the 4th overall selection of this first Fran Duffy mock draft. The New England Patriots with a new head coach, Mike Vrabel, guy who wants to build along the line of scrimmage potentially. You have him taking the best edge rusher in the draft, Abdul Carter from Penn State.
Yeah, a little bit undersized, former linebacker, made the move to the edge for the first time this past season in 2024. And I remember watching that Week 1 game against West Virginia and saying, man, like there's something to work with here from that position switch, because that was going to be a projection, right? He's playing off-ball linebacker. What is he going to look like as a full-time edge rusher? To me, this is a guy that is not one-dimensional. He's not just going to be a designated pass rusher type. He is very willing against the run. He's still a little bit undersized, but if he can fill out that frame a little bit, I think there's plenty there to be able to work with. Now, the big thing when you're looking at Abdul Carter is that they still kind of moved him around as a joker, line him up over the center, line him up over guard, standing up, and just let him go. That's depending on what scheme you go to, that's not necessarily projectable to the NFL, right? So not every scheme is going to allow him to do that. So I do think there's some projection here, but I think when you're looking at the rest of the defensive players in this draft, and honestly the rest of the players overall in this draft, I still feel best about Abdul Carter, his upside, being able to hit that. Is he as good, as refined as some of the other rushers we've seen go in the top 5, top 10 of previous drafts? No, but I still love the player. I love the talent. I think he's got plenty of runway there to be able to make an impact in the NFL.
We'll throw Tyree Wilson out because neither of us quite liked him as a prospect. But so like the Will Anderson, Aiden Hutchinson, Kayvon Thibodeau, Trayvon Walker, those recent top 10 picks, where would he fit in there?
Yeah, I think to me, I would look at Walker and Hutchinson. I would say I would have both of them ahead of where I had Carter.
Okay.
I think when you look at Will Anderson, I would have had him ahead of Carter. And that is going to be a recurring theme in this draft, is when you're talking about a lot of these players that are going to go in the top 10, if you're going to compare them to other guys, their contemporaries in recent years, I was like, yeah, I probably would have taken the other guy.
Okay.
Not that they're bad players.
And is that just the pass rush refinement for him, or is it questions about the athleticism as well?
No, I think like athletically,
okay.
everything. I mean, he's that's why people will compare him to Micah Parsons. I'm a little hesitant to make that comparison. I think Micah is just such a freak at 200. That's the thing to remember. Is that Micah Parsons, 250 pounds, 4.3 speed. I mean, he is one of one in that way in the NFL right now. But I think that Abdul Carter, like the guy I wrote down while watching him early on this year, was Hassan Reddick. Like, you turn into Hassan Reddick, that's worthy of a top 10 pick, right? Yeah. So I do think he's a really good player, but you just have to kind of manage the expectations. I also think, too, Mike Vrabel has had experience getting success out of a player like this. He had got some good years out of Harold Landry in Tennessee, and his similar kind of body type. So I do like the fit there as well.
Is there, and we're going to get on to the other picks, but does it feel like the number 1 overall pick is going to come from one of these 4 guys? Is that fair, or do you think there's any chance that there's anybody else who rises there?
The only person I would say, like, pure wild card, like non-zero chance, and he's actually not even in the mock draft, but like, you know, at quarterback with the dynamic traits, is Jalen Milroe from Alabama. Going to the Senior Bowl. The Senior Bowl has proven to be a place where a quarterback can see that stock rise. And so if Milroe, who's got, honestly, you'd say like maybe the most impressive tools of any of the quarterbacks in this class, if he goes down there and impresses people both on and off the field, that could go a long way as well.
All right, let's take a step back here. Okay. Tell us how you approach this mock draft, because this is not just your ranking of how you grade these players. This is much more what you're hearing, what you're thinking.
Yeah. So the way I approach mock drafts, and I get it, there's lots of different ways that people do it. Some people say like, this is what I would do if I were in all 32 of these seats. I don't think that offers much value personally. Yeah. To me, like if I'm reading a mock draft, I want to see like, what do I think is actually going to happen?
You will also have that content later.
Exactly.
That is your
like,
rankings.
Hey, here are my rankings. Here's how I see these players. But to me, I want to try and project forward what I think is going to happen. And so I do a lot of work in terms of following all 32 teams, their historic trends. I watch every single head coach and GM press conference, especially during the offseason, just kind of pulling in all of that content.
I mean, that is deranged stuff.
But like you get like little nuggets here and there in terms of thought process and what they value, what they don't. You look at like historic trends of, like the Cleveland Browns, like for instance, day 1 and day 2, they don't, for the most part, there's always exceptions, but for the most part, they don't take seniors. They take underclassmen from Power 5 schools, right? So, if it's the second, if I'm doing a 2-round mock draft, which that'll probably start like next month, I'll start doing 2 and 3 rounders once we get into like February, March. If I get into the second round for the Cleveland Browns, I'm probably not going to give them like some redshirt senior offensive tackle, right? Just because from a tendency standpoint, they tend to trend more towards young players from Power 4 schools. So I think when you look all across the landscape, that's one of the things I try and do is try and project what I think those teams are going to do. Obviously, ear to the ground in terms of who are people talking to, who do they like, all of that kind of gets thrown into these mock drafts.
And so this first one of the year, how much were you sort of dragging yourself through the mud? How
less so?
Okay,
yeah, less so. So look, there's obviously a lot of the hay is in the barn in terms of the scouts' work on these players and there's going to be all kinds of reports just because it's the piggies to the trough, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's so much thirst for this content. At the end of the day, how one individual scout from one team feels about a player, while important, and it depends on the team on how levels of importance there. How a coach feels, how a GM feels, how a director of college scouting feels, like all of that kind of gets combined into it. You factor in the medical, you factor in everything that leads over the next few months. So to hear like, oh, the Cleveland Browns really like this player, or the Tennessee Titans, that doesn't mean anything right now as we sit here in early January.
And then this NFL draft show with Fran Duffy, I think our goal to serve both the true sickos and also the people who are sort of coming to the draft.
Yep.
Now I think we can do that. Our cadence, we're going to be doing once a week for sure.
Yes.
On Wednesdays, but we're also going to be mixing in some extra episodes throughout. Obviously, we'll increase the cadence as we get closer to draft season. And then you're already going on the road.
I know. I'm going to the Shrine Bowl down in Frisco, Texas, down at the Star. Following Monday, go from Frisco to Mobile for the Senior Bowl. So I'll be down there for the full week down there.
Jealous of Mobile. I'd love to join you.
Love a Mobile.
The Eagles season continues.
Yes. So I'll do those trips back to back, and then in a few weeks off to Indianapolis for the Combine.
Very exciting.
Yes.
Okay.
I love those trips every year.
Number 5 overall.
Number 5.
The Jacksonville Jaguars.
This is a tough team to do.
Trent, well, just look for the guy with the longest arms.
Right.
Cool. I know, unfortunately, that's not what went on here. But yes, Trent Baalke survives.
Yes.
We'll see who the coach becomes. But you have them going with Michigan defensive tackle Mason Graham.
I will say, whenever a GM gets fired, like a little part of me does die
because of all the work.
Because I've done all the work on the tendency. So I'm like, the fact that only a couple got fired this year, I'm like, oh, all right, we're off and running here. But that said, I went with Mason Graham, the defensive tackle from Michigan. One of the reasons why I love this player.
Any relation to Brandon Graham?
No.
Disappointing.
At least not that I know of.
Okay.
I mean, who knows? Maybe down the line somewhere. Yeah. But when you look at Mason Graham, there's that saying in the summer, when you're making the 53-man roster, like the more you can do. I love the players that can win in lots of different ways. And Mason Graham is one of those players where he's got a fast first step. He's got power. He's got strength in the run game. He can win with technique. He can win with effort. And the more of those boxes you can check as a blue chip talent, the better I'm going to feel about you overall. And I think Mason Graham is one of those high floor, high ceiling type of players. He was the guy who sealed the national championship game for them against Washington last year when the Wolverines won it all with that run stop in the red zone in the final part of the game. So I think when you look at Mason Graham, he can impact the run. He can impact the pass. He can line up at multiple techniques inside. He's a guy I just feel best about. Now, the Jaguars at 5, I wasn't sure quite how to feel. Obviously, they still have to hire a coach, and that's the challenging part about doing that at this stage of the calendar. Some of these, you're kind of making these picks blind. That said, I thought Mason Graham fit, even with 2 first-round picks already on that defensive line. That defense was horrendous this year. They need to add to that side of the ball.
3.5 sacks this year for Mason Graham, 3 sacks last year. If you're taking a guy 5th overall, is he going to provide enough pass rush juice for a defensive tackle?
I think he does have enough juice there.
Okay.
The production certainly has not been stellar, and to the earlier point, like Jalen Carter went 9.
Yeah.
Probably should have gone higher. There obviously were questions around that. Talent-wise, he would have gone higher. If you're putting those guys next to each other, I'm taking Jalen Carter every day, right? So, like, there are, again, going in this draft, I think Mason Graham is a top 5, top 7 type of talent.
Okay. Number 6.
The
Las Vegas Raiders, who don't have a GM or a head coach
blind
just
pick
yet.
Here. Yep.
Who does Tom Brady want them to take? You have it being Arizona wide receiver Tetairoa McMillan, who had 84 catches for 1,319 yards this season, a year after having 90 for over 1,400 as a sophomore a year ago. Best receiver in the draft?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
To me, coming into the year, I had Luther Burden ahead of him, the wide
Okay.
receiver from Missouri. We'll talk about him a little bit later. But yeah, I think McMillan, I mean, they had a down year at Arizona. They lost their coaching staff. So a new coaching staff came in, and it was a little bit of a down year for them when they changed conferences. But I think when you look at Tetairoa McMillan, TMAC has been the abbreviation there. When you look
Shout out to Tim McManus,
of course. I think when you're looking at TMAC, similar in ways to like a Drake London style of player.
Okay.
Right? So this is a big-bodied pass catcher. He's not like purely explosive, like because some people have compared him to Mike Evans. People forget, like Mike Evans, you know, in 2013 when he came out. I mean, this guy was like freak show, straight line speed, was outstanding. And I'm not saying that he can't run, but I think that he's more like loose and fluid and smooth than he is like twitchy, explosive, like wow speed, long.
You are really making me not excited about this top 10. I mean, he sounds good, but Drake London as the top receiver in the draft. Like, okay.
Yeah, well, I promise it levels out once we get into like the early teens.
This class itself.
I think it's, if you had a top 10 pick, you're probably left a little bit wanting. It's not that they're bad players. It's just when you compare them to other guys that typically go in that area, it's a little bit light.
Okay. Why would you call him Tetairoa? Is so fun to say.
It is.
Yeah, I mean, don't shorten that bad boy. You're leaving meat on the bone.
Yeah, look, he's a good player, so I don't get too down on him. He is a good player,
and a Raiders team that could use anything.
They could use a lot.
And Bowers together, you got something in the passing game, I guess.
No question. So you're making that for a soft landing spot for whoever is the quarterback of the future for that team.
Number 7 overall, the New York Jets, who have tried to solve the offensive line for a long time. You have them going back to the well here. Will Campbell from LSU.
Another team that doesn't have a head coach, doesn't have a GM, so it's another blind pick here. I was going back and forth on. All right,
you do work to study Brick Johnson's posts on message boards to see who he likes over the years.
You joke, but that is something that I have to keep in mind. That all right, this is a team where there is going to be some outside influences at play. But I think when you look at my decision here to go with Will Campbell over one of the defensive players, I did think about someone in the secondary. DJ Reed's an impending free agent. Maybe they can get a playmaking safety like Malachi Starks. But I think when you look at, again, a team that wants to be able to get a quarterback here moving forward, they're not going to get that here in this spot. So who are they able to get to bring in to help that future quarterback? I think you look at an offensive lineman and Will Campbell. I really like the player. Some people question whether or not he's a tackler or not. The arm length is going to come into question, I think, with Will Campbell. And so, depending on how you feel about that, you might say, oh, maybe he's a guard. But I still think he can play tackle. And now he's been a 3-year starter at tackle as a true junior for LSU. He came in as a true freshman, started right away. Day one was the starter. I put a lot of stock in guys that do that, especially at a high level of competition, going up against top flight rushers in the SEC and performing well. I mean, there are a lot of players that you see that for the offensive line, when they play early as true freshmen, the numbers are bad. Like the metrics are bad, the amount of pressures and penalties and sacks. He was aces from the jump. So I do really like Will Campbell. He's really strong. Maybe doesn't have like an A+ trait, but just a rock solid player, and I think a guy that's very much worthy. I think even in a typical year, he's going in the top 15.
I mean, is this a guy who could have helium to all the way to number 1? If they really don't like what they see from the quarterbacks and you take the top offensive lineman?
I struggle to see him as that kind of guy.
He's not a special athlete?
Yeah, he's not a special type of player that way. From a physical talent standpoint, he's another one kind of like Mason Graham, where there's strength, there's power, there's enough athleticism there. The body type is a little bit underwhelming for a tackle, as I mentioned. So now it just comes down to how do you feel about him overall? I think if you're the Jets, again, not knowing head coach and GM who's there, you took Olu Fashanu from Penn State last year. He had played some right tackle here for the Jets this year. So maybe, hey, you know what? We're going to make him the full-time right tackle. Let's plug in Will Campbell, the left tackle, and they'll be the bookends for years to come.
I do feel like usually these guys are in the top 20 who it's I don't know if he can stay at tackle. He might have to move inside the guard. I feel like most of those guys do just end up staying at tackle.
Sometimes. I mean, Brandon Scherf was one of them and became an all-pro guard. So we've seen at times those guys. And he went 5 overall. And honestly, I don't think it was I'd have to look back, I guess, at that draft. But, I don't think that people looked at it. Now, Washington didn't bring him back on the second contract. So that kind of came back to bite him in terms of was that a good use of resources? But he was a great player for a long time, Brandon Scherf.
Yeah. Okay. Move on to number 8, a team that has a coach and a general manager.
Yes.
That's exciting.
Well, yeah, I guess. I mean, look, when you look at the way that this team finished down the stretch, it's certainly exciting. The Carolina Panthers.
Now, you do not have them getting help for Bryce Young. You have them addressing the defense. Georgia's Jalen Walker, who is an interesting prospect
Yes.
from a study perspective, right?
Yeah. So he was an off-ball linebacker by like trade, by label. Like that's the way he was used most of the time. But he did play a lot of high leverage snaps as a true defensive end, hand in the dirt, playing off the edge. And so that hybrid skill set, that positionless label has been put on Jalen Walker. I will say, like, I watched him early in the year and I just didn't see it as as an off-ball backer. I don't know what the value is. I saw him more as like a day two type of player. As I think of like Derek Barnes when he was at Purdue a few years back.
Okay.
He was a third-round pick of the Detroit Lions. Hasn't quite hit his ceiling, but that kind of player. Maybe he's a Dante Hightower. Jelani Tavai was another guy that came out, was kind of one of those hybrid players.
Zach Bond.
Well, yeah, exactly. Now here's the thing: even on the edge rush reps, I wasn't like blown away by the athleticism, like that first step quickness. I do think he's got some pop to him. He's going to win with power. But this is a guy that doesn't have like a ton of rush production. We say that every year about the Georgia defenders up front.
Although for that standard, 6.5 sacks for him is not.
It's pretty good.
Not nothing.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But I think when you look at Jalen Walker, it is going to be a projection to say that this guy is going to be a pure edge rusher. If you're taking him this high, it's because he's a pure edge rusher. That said, like I think when you're looking at this scheme, I think it makes sense. Ejiro Evero was retained as the defensive coordinator. He comes from the Vic Fangio school, and they like to utilize those guys that have those multiple skill sets.
They're just backfilling for Brian Burns.
Well, and that's the thing. Like Brian, to me, like if I'm comparing Brian Burns to Jalen Walker as prospects, like no brainer. Brian Burns was far and away a better player coming out of Florida State than what you're looking at with Jalen Walker. But the way when I talk with people, it's like, look at him as an edge rusher, and it might change the way you view him. I will say, like, based off the way I studied him in October, I don't know if I'm going to feel if it's going to completely move me that way, but I'll continue to do more work. That said, everybody seems to think he's going to go like top 10, top 12.
So potentially one of the players in this draft whose stock is most dependent, or at least his upside is most dependent on his testing results.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think if he goes to the combine and doesn't test all that great at that size, and if you're going to say he's going to be an edge rusher, I think that will hurt his overall the viewpoint in terms of him being a potential impact player off the edge.
Okay, we go to number 9, New Orleans Saints, another team without a head coach. Well, they do got Mickey Loomis still.
Yep,
and you've got him going with Will Johnson, the Michigan cornerback.
Yeah, and I really like this fit for the way that New Orleans has approached the draft. And that's one of the things I love about the Saints is that Mickey Loomis has been installed there for a long time. So there are definitely trends that you can follow. Yeah. Oh, it's great. So I think when you're looking at the way, and look, the other thing too is Mickey Loomis, he's got his hand in a lot of pies down there because he's doing stuff with the Pelicans. He's very much like lets some of the executives there do a lot of the heavy lifting from a scouting standpoint. So Jeff Ireland, the former Dolphins GM, he's been in charge of the draft for a long time, and so I don't just because of the fact I know all this.
No, I'm trying to be less Bo on this show, and so I wanted to do a Mickey Mouse, Mickey Loomis impression, and then you said Jeff Ireland, and I really wanted to do an Irish voice,
Mickey.
but I'm not doing it.
So you're growing. This is impressive.
It's a different show.
Yeah, that's true. I'm sure we'll hear about it on the PHLY Eagles show. But I think when you look at the way the Saints draft, they value athletic profiles. They value guys that have the high ceiling. I think when you look at Will Johnson, one player that I think the profile is reminiscent of is Marshawn Lattimore, who Marshawn Lattimore was obviously a first-round pick of the Saints and a longtime starter, one of the better corners in football. Lattimore, when he came out, it was a small sample size. He was a redshirt sophomore out of Ohio State. He was dinged up with hamstring injuries, especially that last year. Will Johnson didn't play a ton this year. He played the first half of the year, was pretty productive for that Michigan defense, but then kind of put on the shelf the second half of the year due to some injuries, and then didn't play down the stretch. So I think when you look at Johnson, the height, the weight, the speed, people actually will question the speed, but he's a fluid athlete. He can play the ball. He's got good instincts. I think that he can come downhill and play as well, be a factor in the run game. So I think when you look at Will Johnson, there's a lot to like here. I could see him going a little bit higher. It wouldn't shock me just because of the upside. I could also see him falling a little bit further. Well, I think Lattimore, if memory serves, went like 12 or 13. I think when you look at Will Johnson, he could go off the board in that range as well, just because of the small sample size, especially from this year.
We expect him to test well?
Some people have questioned the long speed. What is he going to look like when he runs the 40? If he were to run in the 4.3s, low 4.4s, like that would be a huge boom. But some people think he could be a 4.5 guy.
Okay. Close out the top 10.
Yeah.
At number 10 overall, the Chicago Bears. Are they going to get help for Caleb Williams? you have them getting some help protection-wise. Kelvin Banks, the tackle from Texas.
Yeah, and this is another player that some people in the media have had really, really high as a potential top 5 pick. I haven't quite been there with Kelvin Banks Jr.
Okay.
He's been a little bit up and down this year. He was injured in the second half of the season, so he was like in and out of the lineup. It got dinged. He's had some inconsistent play. I watched him against Michigan, and I thought that he was on the ground too much in the Michigan game. I thought the Georgia game, it was a little bit up and down performance from him as well. But this is a guy that's got really high highs. He gets off the ball really well. I think he's got pretty good feet. I think in the run game, there's some technique things and some landmarks and things that can get cleaned up. But a lot of coaches will look at that and say, yeah, we can fix that in minicamp. So I think when you look at the way that Kelvin Banks kind of projects to the NFL, if you're betting on the upside, he could have the highest upside of any tackle in the class. He could be better than Will Campbell. But if you look at what the film has necessarily shown, you might not necessarily see a player that is worthy of the number 10 overall pick. So it's kind of a beauty in the eye of the beholder situation. Now, one thing with the Chicago Bears, with Ryan Poles, this has been a GM in the past that have said, we grade the flashes. We bet on the highs with players. And I think if you're going to be that way, if you have that mindset, you might look at Kelvin Banks Jr., you look at those highs and you say, we're going to bet on his upside. He's a little bit undersized. He's listed 6'3", 6'4", 326 pounds.
Okay.
Question about the arm length. Well, their left tackle for the last few years has been Braxton Jones, who had a similar type of body type. So now he was not a Ryan Poles selection, but I think when you look at they've had success with a tackle of that body type, they might be okay there. But Poles has also in the past been a big proponent of length, and if the arm length does not come through well for Kelvin Banks Jr., that might affect him on certain teams' boards, and Chicago could be one of them.
If you were the Bears general manager and trying to decide how to best build around Caleb Williams moving forward, what would you be thinking, roster building wise?
I think that you look back at last year and you say like, oh, this is going to be the best situation the number 1 pick has ever fallen into. Look at these receivers. And I know that they felt better about that offensive line internally, maybe than people on the outside did, but clearly they did not meet the standard. They felt like Caleb Williams was constantly under duress. So I do think they need to address the trenches. Now, we can get into a discussion about whether Banks is that player for them right here, or if it should be one of the other players that we'll talk about later in the mock draft. But I think when you look at Banks, for them in this spot right now, I would not make this pick personally, but I think that this would be one that, as we sit here in the middle of January, does make the most sense. And
is there a flip side, a guy who draft consensus at the moment seems to think is more of a late first rounder who you like more than Banks?
Yeah, I mean, I like Josh Simmons from Ohio State a little bit more. Now, he goes a few picks later in this mock draft, and he tore his ACL mid-season. So that's the other thing you have to kind of take into account is, all right, well, the film was probably a little bit more consistent this year for Simmons, but coming off the knee, what is that going to look like? The medical check's going to be big for him at the combine. But to me, I like Simmons a little bit more than Banks.
All right, so the Chicago Bears add a tackle to help out their offensive line. Fran, let's do a little background on you.
Oh, all right.
If you don't mind.
Sure.
Fill the people in on when the sickness began.
1999 was the first draft where I was like, yeah, this is pretty cool. It was this was the Tim Couch, Donovan McNabb, Achilles Smith, and the big debate here in Philadelphia was Donovan McNabb versus Ricky Williams. And as a middle schooler at the time, was very much into all right, what's going on with all these players. I wasn't a big college football fan growing up.
Yeah.
So just kind of following along the storylines. That kind of sucked me in, and then that's when the Eagles got good, and then I started diving in deeper into the NFL. Who
did you want, McNabb or Ricky?
I wanted McNabb. Yeah, I felt they needed a quarterback at that point, and so it really was just those two. They didn't really talk about Achilles Smith. It was McNabb or Ricky Williams. But I think when you look at the draft and then the way that things kind of escalated for the Eagles from that point on, I mean, Andy Reid, all the success they had. Now I'm starting to follow all these drafts, and I really kind of got sucked in. I want to say 2003, 2004 was when I'm like, all right, I'm going to sit here all day Saturday, all day Sunday, through 2 days of the draft and watch the entire thing.
Your time at Temple, your time with the Eagles. This has been a lifelong passion.
Yeah, so I got to Temple, graduated from high school in 2004. When I got to Temple, I started, one of my first jobs was doing freelance writing for a fantasy football website, KFFL at the time.
Okay.
And through them was starting to do draft profiles on skill players when they were coming out. So I wrote, the first player I ever wrote up was Kyle Orton.
Nice.
Yeah,
Neckbeard.
yeah, and actually, then they started having me do other players, not just fantasy players. But I did the second one I actually did was D'Amico Ryans. It was the second player I ever wrote up. I still have some of those. It's because they got
First line of the scouting report was incredibly handsome.
Incredibly handsome.
Yeah.
I think that might have been second or third line. But I think when you look at just I was able to kind of get put through the paces there. A couple of years later, I got hired to be a student assistant with the football team doing video. And that's when I was like, oh, there's like coaching film I can watch. Because at that point, I'm just kind of watching TV, watching clips that are on the internet. Once I got into the world of watching the coaching tape, which was in 2006, it just kind of took off from there.
And so now you're grinding the coaching tape on all of these guys in your free time.
Yep.
It is your job. When you are studying a prospect, you talked about before how Ian Cunningham and Ryan Poles, they like to say that they grade the flashes. For you, are you looking for upside? Are you looking for dependability? Does it depend on the position? What's sort of your philosophy?
I think I kind of go case by case, and I think context matters with all of it, right?
Sure.
So if it's a 25-year-old tight end who needs a lot of work, I'm like, oh, man, all right, well, I'm probably not as excited. If it's a 20-year-old who's a first-year starter, didn't start playing football until he was a high school junior, I'm willing to accept like the unrefinement and some of the rawness there. So I think when I kind of take it case by case. I definitely want guys that have traits and guys that have upside. I would say over the last 3 or 4 years, the lens with which I focus on players and try and value players, from a trying to stack the board standpoint, I would say is a little bit unique to how others may do it. And I would say like when I put out a big board later in the spring. There are going to be some names on there that people are like, why is this guy so high or why is this guy so low? And I would say like a big reason for that is that I correlate a lot of my draft evaluations with, all right, what kind of player do I envision this becoming, right? So like, all right, I think he's going to be a good starter at safety. All right, well, here are the players that I think are tiered this way in the NFL. What does that guy get paid from a contract standpoint? And I try and have that all kind of leveled out against other positions. So, there are going to be some players where it might seem a little weird, but I say, hey, you know what? Like, you look at what Quandre Diggs is making right now in the NFL, and you compare that to offensive tackle or linebacker. If you're a pure off-ball linebacker, it's going to be hard for you to be really high on my list. Same thing at running back; those guys are going to get tiered down a little bit. So, it's a little bit of a unique look into the process.
Okay. Now, if you want to read the entire 32 picks of Fran's mock draft, you can check it out on allphly.com or any of the other All-City sites if you are a diehard. But we're going to pick and choose a few more of the picks from this mock draft to discuss. And so at the number 12 overall selection, the Dallas Cowboys. So much smoke already, even though they don't have a head coach, about Ashton Jeanty, the dynamic running back from Boise State, because they need a running back. That is not where you have them going.
I thought about it. I had it there in pencil to start when I started doing the mock. And then as I thought about it a little bit more, I said, you know what? I think that maybe they wait because this is a very good running back class, a very talented group. I think once you get into the second round, the third round, there are a lot of options available at that position. Now, Dallas is a team in the past, and they've said this publicly, and there's been reports from media types down there as well about this, is that they like to be first at a position. They do like to start the run.
Interesting.
Yeah, they like to be able to, hey, you know what, and this might be at guard, it might be at linebacker, whatever the position is, they like to be first.
As opposed to getting the leftovers.
So as opposed to taking, if right now, like I haven't taken Luther Burden, the wide receiver from Missouri, so this would be wide receiver 2. So you could say, all right, like if you have Ashton Jeanty here and you have Luther Burden here, maybe I prefer taking Ashton Jeanty because of the RB1 as opposed to wide receiver 2. That said, I just think when you look at this pass game, the way that this team has operated in recent years where they've devalued running back, obviously the lack of resources they put into it the last couple of years and overcorrection from what they did previously.
It's so funny because it's the same like front office staff.
Right. They completely flipped in terms of the way they handled it and to a detriment, right? I mean, that offense just lacked any kind of juice. They lacked any kind of oomph in the run game this season. I know it got a little bit better in the second half, but I think when you look at this group overall, they need more help for Dak Prescott in the pass game, another running mate there for CeeDee Lamb. So I went with Luther Burden, a player that I think is really dynamic. I mentioned coming into the season, he was my wide receiver 1. I think if you're looking at the way that Malik Neighbors can impact the game, he can attack you with the deep ball. He can win over the middle of the field, yards after catch. He's got some sharpness to him as a route runner, some dynamic qualities athletically. So he had a little bit of a down year from a production standpoint, not as productive as he was last year for Mizzou, but this is a player that I was really, really high on coming in. And even though the numbers weren't there in 2024, I still think that this guy's a dynamite player moving to the NFL.
It went from 86 catches for over 1,200 yards last year to 61 for just 676 this year while playing pretty much the same amount of games. What was the reason for that?
Yeah, I think that, I want to do a little bit more work before I say definitively, but I think the surrounding talent there in Mizzou.
It sounds to me like Jalen Reagor again. We're throwing that quarterback under the bus.
I have a name. I have a bunch of names listed with this comp for Luther Burden. Reagor is one of them.
Interesting.
In terms of like the way he's built physically, the way he looks. So I would say there's some similarities there from a play style standpoint. I also have like Brandon Cooks down there. Like he's a movement type, screen game, yards after catch, shallow crosses, but also can catch the deep ball. He can beat you in a lot of different ways. Now, again, I was very close to making this Ashton Jeanty, and I was interested to see, all right, like if he doesn't go here at 12, like how far does he slide? They've had a lot of success, Dallas, going to Boise and plucking players. Tank Lawrence, they got out of Boise. Then this is with this leadership, with Will McClay making picks as well. Tank Lawrence, Leighton Vander Esch, they took Cedric Wilson and made him a good player out of Boise. So I think that's something where, it's like the Eagles with Cincinnati. Like, you feel comfortable once you've had success and you've made some good meals shopping in that aisle, the supermarket. You want to go back to that aisle. I do think that there's something there with Jeanty, but I had them passing.
Luther Burden, you think can win on the outside? Just thinking of him as a fit with CeeDee Lamb, who does so much of his work in the slot.
Yeah, he can do a little bit of both. Okay. So I think that with CeeDee Lamb being used in that same way, I think that fits in perfectly.
All right, let's move now to number 16 overall, where the Arizona Cardinals are on the clock, and you know Jonathan Gannon well, and you thought that Texas A&M edge Nick Scorton is his kind of player.
Yeah, I went back and forth. I think when you look at the way that this defense is structured, I mean, I know they spent a first-round pick on the defensive lineman Darius Robinson last year. Did not get a huge impact out of him this year just because of the injury. He came in, didn't play. He missed a large chunk of the first half of the year. But I think when you look at this Arizona defense, the way that they were able to create pressure was, I don't want to say like smoke and mirrors, but basically they were trying to out-scheme everybody on a weekly basis, and they're just at a little bit of a talent deficit up front. Now, when you look at Nick Scorton, the reason why I think that he's a good fit for Jonathan Gannon is that he is a multifaceted player and that he can win against as a rusher. He can defend the run. He plays with a lot of violence. We've heard JG, some of those things that he has said over and over in press conferences, motor and mean, and guys that are fanatical to the football. That is the way that Nick Scorton plays. He's kind of like a lowercase Jared Verse in terms of from that standpoint, where he's not like the most impressive physical specimen. But I think that the way that he plays, that fanatical effort, the physicality, all of that transitions. Now, he led the Big Ten in sacks last year, 2023 at Purdue. Goes down to the SEC, Texas A&M, and a lot of that production got cut in half.
Went from 10 to 5.
Went from 10 to 5, but even like the pressure rate, went down a little bit. So a lot of the efficiency metrics were not what they were the previous year, which is a little bit of a concern. It's not like Verse, where Verse was at Albany and was tearing up the competition and then went to the ACC and continued that level of production. But I think when you look at Scorton, he is a player that I think fits the mold stylistically of what Jonathan Gannon wants from his defensive players.
Any other thoughts position-wise for what the Cardinals might be interested in?
Yeah, I thought about a receiver there, in that spot. There were some options there available. Offensive line, certainly, continuing to try to bolster the trenches. But I think overall, like, this team just needs more blue-chip players on defense. So to me, it was, all right, who was the best defensive player on the board that fits the mindset of what Jonathan Gannon wants on that side?
All right. We move to number 20 overall. The Denver Broncos on the clock, and they are selecting running back Ashton Jeanty, bringing some juice from Boise to Denver.
Yeah, and this one was fun. I wanted to see how far Ashton Jeanty would slide. If he didn't go at 12 to Dallas, who was the team that was going to end up calling his name? And I ended up going with the Denver Broncos. Now, Sean Payton, he's had experience taking a round one running back. He's not averse to that. He did it with Mark Ingram coming out of Alabama a while ago now at this point. Yeah. But he's had experience there. He wants to be able to run the football. This is Sean Payton. I know he's always regarded as a passing mastermind from that standpoint schematically, but he wants to be able to run the football. We saw them. He always had like a two-headed monster everywhere he had been in terms of having that success in previous stops, whether it was as an offensive coordinator or as a head coach. And so I look at it and say, all right, they just spent a pick on an Audric Estime in the 4th round last year out of Notre Dame. Javonte Williams, not quite what he was pre-injury. So here you get Ashton Jeanty. The other thing with Sean Payton is that he usually trends towards players from bigger schools. But when he has said numerous times that if we're going to go to a smaller school, you better dominate. No one has dominated more than Ashton Jeanty at that level of competition in the group of 5, even against the P5 competition, the Power 4 competition. He always excelled. So I think when you're looking at Jeanty, I think he's a really good scheme fit. This is a playoff roster, right? So a team where if you can get a blue chip running back and add him to that ecosystem with Bo Nix to kind of help him out, I think it makes a lot of sense there. And I think even
defense is in good shape with good young players, not a lot of turnover expected there. And then, you could overrate one game, but in their playoff loss to the Buffalo Bills, their running backs combined for 11 carries for 35 yards.
Yeah. And again, this is a coach that wants to be able to run the football. So I look at this fit here as something where it would make sense. And even, look, Sean Payton is the one that's calling the shots there in Denver, but George Payton, the GM, he also, before Sean Payton got there, had spent some high-quality picks, high assets on non-priority positions. So I don't think the Heat even push back on this one either. So I think when you look at it, I think this one makes a lot of sense.
Now, you have also said that this is a good running back draft class.
Yep.
Do you believe that Jeanty is a solid full tier above the rest of the guys?
I do, yes. I think that at some, and honestly, like he could, this is 20 overall. If he went 12, if he went 10, if he went 13, I'm just throwing numbers out. It would not. He is that
told me
kind of player.
this draft is not great at the top.
That's what I mean.
Could he go 7?
Yeah, like Bijan Robinson went 8. Like Jeanty could go that high. If someone says, you know what, like he is just that much better than everybody else, I will say, like on my board, he is going to be in that tier. But it's just a matter of how every team is going to feel about it. And there's honestly, when you're trying to play matchmaker, there aren't a lot of great fits in terms of like, all right, this team already has a big asset or has a lot of money invested in that position. So trying to find that was tricky for this exercise.
Is there another running back who you think might be first-round caliber?
I think that Omarion Hampton from UNC, I think is the next guy that might challenge that. But I do think he's probably a cut below in terms of what you typically would see at that position.
All right. Good stuff for the Broncos. Let's move on. Let's just get right to it. Let's go right to the Eagles.
Okay.
Fran, you have been picking 28th overall, so
I'm going off of what the draft order was if it ended, and then
all right.
Just going.
Just saying, you don't have them going to the Super Bowl.
That's what I'm going off the odds and like the records and things like that.
Before we get to the pick,
okay,
let's take a step back because I know that we have a lot of Eagles fans watching. Where do you expect this team position-wise to be looking in the first round of the draft?
I think you start with the trenches all the time. Like every year, just start with the trenches and just like assume that that's priority number one. And if there's somebody there on either side of the line of scrimmage that is, in that upper tier in terms of who's best player on the board, I think that you probably lean that direction. So I would start there. I think then after that, that's when you start getting into discussions about tight end. You start getting into discussions about maybe safety. But after that, like I really feel
I think it's a pretty narrow band for the top of the draft for the Eagles. I think it's tackle or edge.
Maybe
pretty much that's it, and then maybe D tackle if Milton Williams leaves.
About it. Yeah.
And maybe tight end if that's just the way that the board falls.
Right.
I think that is a possibility. And they move on from Dallas Cowboys. So in this scenario, you have them going with Minnesota tight end Ariante Ursary.
Minnesota tackle,
Ariante Ursary. I know it's a tackle. I said it wrong. I said Ariante right. I was so focused on that.
You nailed it. You really stuck the landing there.
Ariante.
Ursary is a really interesting player. And I think when you look at his background, there are a lot of aspects to it that say like, oh yeah, this sounds like the Eagles type of player. Did not start playing football until late in his high school career.
Love it. Checks the box. Yep.
Has played both sides. Has played left tackle and right tackle.
Love it.
I believe he was a 3-year starter at left tackle, and in his redshirt year played right tackle in games. Also played like a handful of snaps at guard, and at north of 320 pounds. I think he's got the size to be able to, especially for Jeff Stoutland, to be able to play guard in a pinch. So
I think I hear Jeff Stoutland running here right now so far based on this description.
And he was on Feldman's freak list as one of the top athletes in college football.
Okay.
I think that does show up on tape. You do see that movement skills. I wouldn't say he's like the level of Jordan Mailata, Lane Johnson, Cam. He's not like that level of athlete, but certainly for a big man, this is a guy that can get out and move. He can make those blocks in space, and he's just unrefined. You can see like the hands in the pass game, up and down, hands and landmarks in the run game, a little bit up and down. A guy that needs some good coaching, but the physical traits are all there.
If it's not a tackle,
okay,
who are the edges who would be available right now? In this draft, you've got a couple guys going at the end of the first round.
Yep.
Mike Green from Marshall and James Pierce Jr. from Tennessee. Either of those guys potential fits for the Eagles?
You know, when I look at James Pierce Jr. from Tennessee, he ends up going to Washington in this mock draft. And the reason why I think he wouldn't necessarily be a great fit, this is a one-year starter at Tennessee, was a 4-year player, former big-time recruit, pure like high side rusher, and his impact against the run. I wouldn't say that he's like a pure like designated pass rusher, like don't get him on the field in rundowns, but it's certainly not a strength of his game. And I think when you look at Vic Fangio, it's important for those guys that are on the edge to be quality, not necessarily an impact player, but you have to be a reliable contributor as an edge setter in the run game. And I just don't know if James Pierce Jr. is going to be able to meet that threshold for Vic Fangio in this scheme. Now, he does other things that I think would make him a fit. I don't know that you would necessarily want like he and Nolan Smith to be like those guys opposite because they're similar type of body types.
Okay.
To me, like if I watch James Pierce Jr. and watch it, I was much higher on Nolan Smith than I am right now on Pierce Jr. And so I looked at that. I said, all right, that's probably not a fit there. And then who was the other player?
Mike Green.
From Mike Green from Marshall. Mike Green is an interesting player. So coming out of high school, was an athlete recruit, was a wide receiver, linebacker, goes to UVA, goes to Virginia, and doesn't really get on the field there for a couple of years, transfers down to Marshall, and was outrageous this year. His first year starter, so he's only got 1 year of starting experience, but was insanely productive. One of the leading sack players in football this past season for the Thundering Herd. But not even though he was like a wide receiver and linebacker in high school, I wasn't blown away by the traits on film. I think he's a solid athlete, a solid mover, but not a guy where like I'm looking at the first step and saying, "Wow, like look at this guy get off the ball." So I don't think he's unique from that standpoint. He's got a little bit of a modest frame. I don't know that I want him playing in reverse all that often. So I think that multiple, he's more of like a straight like 4-3 DN with solid size. And in this scheme, I didn't think that the fit was perfect.
And then how about Tyleik Williams from Ohio State? Looks like maybe the versatility to, if they let Milton Williams go, maybe be able to play between edge and tackle.
Yeah, I think that he's another player where I don't know that because we know that they like to use the unique word, right? They like to throw that unusual term around with players. I don't know that Tyleik Williams is the perfect fit for that. I will say the one guy that I did think about there was Walter Nolan, the defensive tackle from Ole Miss, who from a pure talent standpoint, this guy is like, the name I wrote down while watching was Jalen Carter.
Interesting.
The way that he can win with quickness, with power, with his athleticism. He's a little bit unrefined still. He was a 5-star recruit coming out of high school, goes to Texas A&M, relatively quiet the first couple of years, goes into the transfer portal when they made the coaching change, goes to Ole Miss this year and was lights out. First team All SEC for Lane Kiffin down there, and one of the best defensive lines in football. I think that there are some things that everyone's kind of working through from his departure from Texas A&M, like didn't go as clean. So depending on who you talk to, there's some messiness there. But overall, the talent with Walter Nolan really, really stands out. And he's going to the Senior Bowl as a true junior. So he's a player where if he like lights up one-on-ones, he's going top 15, top 20.
This is a player who, we've talked about some players in the beginning of this episode who you don't have graded as a top 10 pick, but you are expecting, based on reports at the moment, to be potentially a top 10 pick. This is a guy where you have him at 32 overall, but you would grade him as a top 15 player in this class.
Yeah, I think he's like right now, I can take a look at where I've got him on my list. It's higher than 32 for certain. Let me just check real quick. Yeah, he's 15 right now. So,
okay.
Yeah, this is a good player, good talent.
Last position to ask you about from an Eagles perspective, but also just a big picture for everybody. Tight end at the end of this first round. You have Colston Loveland from Michigan going. You don't have Tyler Warren going in the first round.
No, I do. I got him 14 to the Colts.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've got Ty Warren.
Whoops.
Going, yeah, it's okay. I've got Warren going 14 to the Colts. He grew on me as I watched him more. I would say with Tyler Warren, I watched him very early in the season, and it was very apparent that Penn State just didn't have a ton of talent outside of him, right? Mm-hmm. Especially in the pass catching group. And so as I'm watching, I'm like, all right, like he's a good athlete, but he's not a great going at 14. That's where Brock Bowers went last year. He is not Brock Bowers. Like that, he is not that level of player. But he's a good player. He's a good athlete. He's really good after the catch. They found every way possible to get him the football. They put him in the backfield and had him take direct snaps. They did all kinds of stuff with him. So it's fun usage. But again, like not as dynamic as some of the other athletes that we've seen at that position. That said, he doesn't put the ball on the ground. He's great after the catch. He contributes as a blocker. He's a really good player. To me, like I think in this class, he's probably a top 20 pick. I think when you look at Colston Loveland, I was left a little bit wanting. He would be a player that
For you, it was more Colston Lakeland.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay.
Yeah. I was definitely a little bit lukewarm there on Colston Loveland. And it's not that I think he's bad. I think that he's probably more like day 2 as opposed to day 1. But again, as we sit here today, it seems like the consensus is that he's going to go that high. And so until I hear differently, I will have him in the mock draft. I think that the Rams, honestly, ironically enough, with both teams that took these players. So the Rams, I had taking Loveland, and then I had the Colts taking Ty Warren. Both of those teams were linked to trying to trade up for Brock Bowers a year ago. And so they end up with a tight end here in round 1.
All right. First mock draft in the can. I know you feel good to have that behind you. What is ahead of you is a trip to the Shrine Bowl and the Senior Bowl over the next 2 weeks. What are the things that you're most looking forward to seeing?
Yeah, I mean, look, both games, there are some potential first-round picks at both.
At the Shrine as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Shrine, Shedeur Sanders is going to be at the Shrine.
Oh.
And so what we're going to see from the Colorado quarterback, who, as we talked about, I've got going number 3 to the New York Giants in my mock draft. He's going down there with a bunch of his Colorado teammates. He's bringing the whole crew is going with him, offense and defense. And so a bunch of Buffaloes will be down there, but Shedeur obviously is going to be the spotlight, but he's not the only potential round 1 pick there. I mean, Siobhan Revelle is a guy I had going in the mock draft. He's an injured corner from ECU, so he will not be participating. That was a rule that they changed apparently, but Revelle is going to be down there. Very talented player. I'd say it kind of reminds me a little bit of like a DRC type of like body type. The height, weight, speed is outstanding. So he will be there. Kenneth Grant, another potential first-round pick, nose tackle from Michigan. He will be there and is supposed to be practicing. He's not injured, so we should see Kenneth Grant down there in Dallas at the Star. So it's going to be an exciting week. A lot of talent down there at the Shrine. Shrine
Bowl has come a long way since those Romeo Crennel special teams periods.
I hope so.
To have Shedeur Sanders there. I mean,
yeah. I mean, look, they've had some talented players certainly over these last couple of years. I mean, they had Zay Flowers a couple of years ago when he was a first-round pick for the Ravens, and so no, it should be a good showcase for a lot of talented players. And
then the following week of the Senior Bowl. Now we will have coverage of both of those things from you for the diehards on All City. But Senior Bowl, is there anybody who is in your mind thought of as a second, third round guy right now who could pop all the way to round 1 with a big week?
That's a good question. Jalen Milroe, we talked about a little bit here in the show. I think that Milroe, the quarterback from Alabama, junior, gets the opportunity to go to Alabama or go to the Senior Bowl and elevate his stock with a strong week. I think when you look at Gray Zabel, an offensive lineman from North Dakota State, played left tackle there, but he's played every position along the offensive line. He reminds me a lot of Graham Barton, the first-round pick for the Tampa Bay Bucks, who made that transition from tackle to center. I think that Zabel could do the same thing. And then you start just looking at this defensive line, that group that's down there. Nick Scorton, we talked about already. Shamar Stewart, both guys from Texas A&M. But you go right down that list. Walter Nolan, 3 or 4 potential first-round picks. So now what that means is, how does the pecking order change with those guys? Are there other players that look better than these proposed first-round talents? How do the offensive linemen look against these first-round picks? And so, to me, there's a lot of room for growth. We know those O-line, D-line one-on-ones can be kingmakers for those guys. So how that shakes out next week, it's going to be big for when it comes to round 1 of the draft.
All right. Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Looking forward to talking about it. Looking forward to reading about it and all that good stuff with our draft coverage on All City and PHLY.
Yeah,
how'd you feel?
Great, I'm excited. Well, look, it's going to be. I'm going to be doing hits, from Mobile, from the Shrine. Obviously, it's a little bit different here at PHLY because with the Eagles being where they're at in the postseason. So I won't be doing as many video hits here for PHLY, but I'll be doing daily practice reports from all these practices. So every day when I go to practice, you can go to allphly.com and check out some of my notes on all these players.
All right, that'll do it for the first episode of the PHLY Draft Show with Fran Duffy. We will be back next week with maybe some extra episodes sprinkled in as Fran is on the scene at the All-Star Games. Much more to come draft coverage-wise on PHLY and All City. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next week.
We all city like the mayor.